Hello and welcome to this look at urbanization in cities in developing countries. The image on your screen is a photo taken in Sao Paulo, Brazil. On the right-hand side, you see the accumulation of wealth that is occurring in cities in developing countries today. On the left, you see what's known as a favela. Favela is a Brazilian Portuguese term for slum. This slum is known as Paraisópolis, known as Paradise City. 80 to 100,000 Brazilians live in this slum. They live a drastically different world from those just over the wall in the middle of the screen. So this image helps us set our framework for our look at these cities in developing countries. When we ask ourselves, what, where, and why are these cities growing, evolving, changing? We're going to look at some of the significance and concerns associated with these cities, and we'll look at opportunities and challenges. While the right-hand side of the picture certainly reflects opportunity, the left-hand side also reflects opportunity. There is a reason why upwards of 100,000 people have moved into this favela. There's a reason why people find this area not only challenging, but as a site of opportunity. When we look at cities in developing countries, we again try to classify how these cities are different than some of our older cities, some of our cities that are found in North America and Western Europe that grew beginning in the 19th century during industrialization. When we ask ourselves, what are these cities? We recognize that these cities are the result of rapid urbanization that have been occurring in our developing countries since around 1970. This is occurring in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we also see that some of these cities, ironically, are found in areas of our original urban places, our original city-states dating back 7,000 years. Why? Why are we finding rapid urbanization in parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Well, one is globalization. Over the last 50 years or so, our Earth has what we call flattened as transportation and telecommunication have improved and neoliberal trade policies have promoted free trade. We have become closer to other parts of the world. Today, we are more interconnected and interdependent to other people, places, and institutions around the world than at any time in history. Globalization also reflects a lot of our original international trade agreements where our big markets were connected to sources of raw materials. So we'll see how certain cities and certain countries reflect this original acquisition or exploitation of raw materials. And today, these areas that were formerly sites of raw materials have grown into massive cities. We look at economic integration. Again, part of globalization is the economic integration of different countries and cities and markets around the world. Industrialization is what really allowed these cities to grow. It's difficult to have high levels of urbanization without high levels of industrialization, at least early on. Many of these booming developing country cities got on the scene or originally grew through industrialization, today are transitioning to service-based economies, much like the trajectory of the United States, Canada, several countries in Western Europe that started out as industrial manufacturing economies but evolved into a post-industrial economy. So we're starting to see signs of that in our cities in developing countries. Rural to urban migration, yes, that's been the requisite for urbanization throughout history, but what we're seeing is that it's occurring today at unprecedented levels. We are seeing the number of people moving from the countryside to the city at such extreme levels that our past urbanization experiences cannot match the movement of people going from rural to urban areas today. And in some cases, the cities in developing countries are the result of government intervention. And this is usually associated with communism. China, a former socialist state in Brazil, they set they design the location of cities to provide certain functions, oftentimes government functions or defense functions or shipbuilding functions. And these cities, over time, can serve as growth poles and attract people from all over that region of the country, can, through government intervention, become more economically integrated with national and global markets. But government intervention doesn't extend to all countries. And when we look at some of our examples, we're going to see how really China is a prime example of government intervention, but rapid growth in other places is more the result of capitalism. The significance, again, we're looking at unprecedented scale, speed, and size. The scale of our cities, the vast footprint, the enormity of it, the speed at which they're growing is unprecedented. It took New York City about 150 years to add 8 million people. Some of our cities in the developing world are adding 8 million people in 12, 15, 20 years, just a fraction of the time. In the size, again, we're talking about the number of people, the sheer number of people that are expanding our cities. While we often look at numbers as simple data sets, we need to recognize that when 8 million people are added to a city in a little over a decade, that's going to have a significant impact on sense of place. We see that our cities in the developing countries are driving overall levels of urbanization. So while places like the United States have had over 50% of the population living in urban areas for over a century, it's just starting to catch up in other parts of the world. The image on the right-hand side of your screen shows level of urbanization. And you see Singapore, which is known as a city-state, is 100% urbanized, meaning the entire population lives within the metro area. The United States today is about 85%. You dip down to China, which is about 55%. Then you go down to India, which is a little over 30%. India has over 1 billion people. India has some of our largest cities on earth. Yet India remains primarily rural. So think about that for a minute as we talk about the rapid speed, growth, and size of change in our developing countries. India is not even halfway urbanized yet. So there is still room for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people to migrate into cities in the coming decades. When we look at our global urban population, meaning the percentage of people that live in cities, we see relatively little change early on. By 1850, only about 5% of the world lived in cities. We were primarily agrarian, farm-based economies. At the beginning of the term, we looked at different theories, and we explored how cities like Manchester changed in the 1800s and how people saw this as a negative sign of human change, of social change. How we had Gesellschaft and Gesellschaft try to explain the difference between city and country. It's because in the mid 1800s, very few people lived in cities. This was the early stages of industrialization that attracted people from the countryside. In 1850, only 3 cities had over 1 million people: London, Paris, and Beijing. By 1900, we doubled the percentage of people living in cities. We're up to 10% as urbanization followed industrialization throughout Western Europe and North America. By 1950, about a quarter of the world's population lived in cities. At this time, New York City was a global leader in population. New York, London, Beijing. By 2008, we reached 50%. And this was a conservative estimate by the United Nations. Many believe that prior to 2000, many sources believe that prior to 2000, we actually reached 50%. Within the next 30 years, we're expected to reach 70% of our population on Earth live in cities. And again, this is growing the most rapid in developing countries, in areas with massive populations, and as we'll see, oftentimes the sites of little support, little government or market support to accommodate these massive populations. We've seen the growth in megacities. A megacity is defined as 10 million or more people living in an urban area. We have about 35 megacities today, up from very few in 1950. So we're seeing not only a rapid rise in the percentage of people living in cities, we're also seeing the rapid rise in massive cities. And again, it's taking a matter of years now for us to add millions and millions of people to existing cities, where in the past it took generations. To highlight this rapid growth, we visit a city called Shenzhen. Shenzhen is at the center of an agglomeration known as the Pearl River Delta megalopolis. A megalopolis is a cluster of metropolitan areas that are linked by economic activities. They're linked by transportation. They're linked by a variety of networks. Closer to home, we have the megalopolis in the United States, which extends from Northern Virginia up through southeastern Maine, connecting cities like Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, into a network of cities that cross state boundaries and are linked by economic activity and are linked by transportation and the movement of people. Well, in the Pearl River Delta, we have a similar situation. The image on your screen is Shenzhen in the 1970s. This is a relatively rural area, a small town, a place for trade of agricultural goods. 1979, China designated this area as a special economic zone, an SEZ. This is an example of government intervention promoting the rapid growth in our developing countries. The special economic zone opened up low-cost Chinese labor to produce for the global markets. In 1980, we had 58,000 people. A year after this status was set forth. You can see Shenzhen today, that same location, 40 years after the designation. It is no longer a rural area with small trading outposts. It is a massive city. Here's the road, the Shenzhen Road, that going into the early phases of the city. This is a picture from 1985. You can see a new road and some automobile traffic, lots of bike, motorcycle, moped traffic. Same road today. Drastically changed this place. From 58,000 people in 1980 to part of a 65 million person agglomeration today. So Shenzhen has upwards of 11 million people in its city alone. And Shenzhen is only part of this network of cities. So again, when we look at the scale, the speed, the size of change that's occurring in our developing countries, Shenzhen highlights this unprecedented level of transformation. When we look at our population figures, again, we see the world's percentage of people living in cities in 1950 at just under 30%. We're over 50% today, and we're heading towards 70%. Our more developed regions are nearly 80% today, and again, the United States is around 85%. But where we see the rapid growth occurring is in our less developed or developing regions. In the 1950s, about 1 in 6 people lived in cities. By 2050, we're looking at about 2/3 of people in developing regions are going to live in cities. And again, these developing regions are home to the vast majority of people on Earth. So the size of these cities are going to continue to grow at levels, at sizes never seen before. Again, our mega cities are our cities with 10 million or more people. A few years ago, the United Nations put this data set together, showing Tokyo is the leader with almost 40 million people, followed by Delhi in India, Shanghai in China, Mexico City, Mexico, Mumbai, another Indian city, Sao Paulo, Brazil. By 2030, you see the top 3 don't change, but Mumbai is growing pretty rapidly, about a 30% increase in just 20 years. Dhaka, Bangladesh, not even on the chart on the left, exceeding 27 million people in just a few more years. Cairo, Egypt, one of our biggest cities. So with this rapid growth, we're going to look at some concerns and opportunities.